Okay, good evening, everyone. I'm Paul Bramadat, and I know most of you, but not all of you, so I'll let you know I'm the director of the CSRS at the University of Victoria. Welcome to our Thursday public lecture series. Before we begin, just a quick announcement. Our Thursday talks run until April 14th this year, and all of the lectures will be online, except for the April 7th event, which, pandemic permitting, will be a special in-person gala event featuring our two artists in residence this year. Stay tuned for information on that special event, but just know that the regular Thursday lectures will be all online for the rest of this series. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, the Esquimalt, and Wasanish peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Today's speaker is Jerry Flexer, a PhD student in the interdisciplinary PhD program at UVic, with Martin Adam and Nilesh Bose as his supervisors. Jerry was selected by the history department as this year's Lansdowne Fellow, Lonsdale Fellow, pardon me. He is interested in Indian history, the social forces that impact the way Indian traditions land in the West, and the emergence of new religious movements. This afternoon, he'll introduce us to one of the most interesting examples of such innovations in the religious arena. And so without further delay, please join me in welcoming Jerry Flexer to the CSRS digital stage.
Thank you, Paul. So this is a bit of my story with the American psychologist Abraham Maslow and Jiddu Krishnamurti. Personal journey from psychology to religion and back. So sometime around the turn of the last century, or millennium actually, I sort of had this, my own education in psychology. I looked at humanistic psychology and did a lot of reading in that and transpersonal psychology. And I discovered Abraham Maslow, Ken Wilber, Alan Watts. But I just want to say, so everybody knows, the way I see it, I haven't been a spiritual seeker, as maybe some of you are familiar with that term. So what I discovered in Abraham Maslow's psychology is this notion of the self-actualized individual. This goes back to 1950, so it's 70 years ago. Abraham Maslow suggested that an individual who is self-actualized is somebody who is familiar with themselves as a way to individual growth. And Maslow suggested that understanding ourselves also leads to understanding others, which leads to world peace. Self-actualized people make full use of their talents and capacities, and they're interested in this German thing called Gemeinschaftsgefühl, which was a word that Maslow borrowed from the psychologist Adler. It's about feelings of community for all. Self-actualized people are also efficient at perceiving reality and are comfortable with it. They're easy to accept others and nature and themselves. They're autonomous, which means they have some sense of independence from culture and they enjoy solitude and privacy. They're more inclined to what Maslow called peak experiences. So I set off in 1999-2000 at the turn of the millennium to share my Gemeinschaftsgefühl. I went looking for communities and eco-villages. And in January 2000, I was in Australia and I received a copy of a Krishnamurti book as a gift. It was a book called Freedom from the Known. My first deep encounter into Krishnamurti. And here's just a little excerpt from that book, which seems to me like psychology, as opposed to, say, a religion. Here's Krishnamurti talking about understanding myself, which helps in relationships to outward things and people. Then I came back to Canada in 2002, and in 2009, I became a student at UVic. I was in fine arts. I did a writing degree. I took humanities electives, and I also took my first religious studies course about religion and existentialism completely by accident. I was recruited to take the course by some folks who needed some more students. So then after that, I took some more religious studies courses, especially some in Eastern religions like Buddhism. And I finished my BA in writing in 2016. I wrote a lot of personal essays, many of them with what seems to me now to be sort of religious or spiritual themes. About Krishnamurti, he was born in 1895 in what we know as India, died in 1986 in California. He was discovered by theosophists, sort of this universal religion that started in 1875 and still exists to this day, sort of. He was taken to England to be tutored because he was proclaimed to be the next world teacher, the coming of the Messiah. But he never had any great deal of formal education, no degrees, never held a job. He had sort of a physical and psychological awakening process that started in 1922 in California. In 1929, he dissolved this religious order that was created for him by the Theosophists in a famous speech in 1929 that I know as "The Truth is a Pathless Land" speech, where he said, "My purpose is to set man free." And he said that there's no point in having any organization. He didn't want any followers or any disciples, so he disbanded the organization. And he continued from that point on to travel around the world, speaking without any notes, always in English. And from 1940 onward, made his home base in California. Today, there are foundations and charitable organizations that disseminate his teachings. In other words, publications of recorded and transcribed talks. He's well known for contributions to peace and education. And this is just something that came into my inbox today. Just part of the social media that the Krishnamurti organizations send out to interested people. And this is about conflict. So peace and conflict individually and outward, these are things that are of concern to Krishnamurti. So in 2016, I started my master's degree, and I was looking at Krishnamurti's dialogic approach in education. And of course, I started to learn a whole lot more about Krishnamurti. And that's how I got started with my PhD in 2019. And I thought of the possibility that Krishnamurti was perhaps the founder of a religion without belief. So I was looking at Krishnamurti as being a religious philosopher. Where did that come from? I'll get to that in a minute, but Krishnamurti's focus, the way I see it, is that he's mostly concerned with the individual mind, which I see as psychology. But he talks about religious themes as well. He talks about religious mind, meditation, things like choiceless awareness, self-knowledge, God, belief, love, relationships. To me, that's all just about life, which is psychology. Maybe. But he's not just in the individual, he's also indicating that the revolution that takes place in the individual, because individuals create society, then it also has an impact on society all around us. In other words, you are the world, is what he said. This is what Krishnamurti thinks of organized religion. Now, I discovered the idea of Krishnamurti as being a religious philosopher by reading Hilary Rodrigues, who did his master's degree on Krishnamurti and is now in the religious studies department at Lethbridge University. So Hilary compares Krishnamurti's teachings with Buddhism and Advaita Vedanta. For example, other people consider Krishnamurti's teaching to be very much like Zen Buddhism. Here's what Hilary Rodrigues says on Krishnamurti's religious mind. There's a conflict, according to Krishnamurti, between religious traditions that distinguish between worldly life and the religious life. And he quotes Krishnamurti as suggesting that what we should do is focus on the fact that religious life is concerned with the whole of life, not with one particular aspect. Here's some idea of what Krishnamurti thinks about what conditioning means and how it relates to religious beliefs. This gives you an idea of what we're talking about when we talk about beliefs in this context. So Krishnamurti has this concept of what is, which is his way, I think, of referring to reality, an accurate perception of reality and what's out there, what happens, and it includes everything, thoughts, activities, processes, and the ability to observe all these things is what Krishnamurti refers to as intelligence. It's the ability to understand one's own conditioning, to become aware of conditioning influences. Well, he says belief is necessary. He's very much interested in encouraging people to overcome this idea of belief in anything, any concept, formula, idea. A key concept for me and for Hilary Rodrigues and for Krishnamurti, when we talk about him being a religious philosopher, is this idea of religious mind, which he says is completely different from being religious or somebody who believes in religion. For Krishnamurti, the religious mind is psychologically free from the culture of society and free from any form of belief. A conversation reported by Laura Huxley between her and Krishnamurti involved his listing of 3 criteria for what he thinks, in his opinion, a religious person is. A person who's alone and free of conditioning, a person who appreciates the dual nature of everything, and a person who is not tied to the past, to convictions or interpretations. When I started delving deeply into the area of knowledge called the psychology of religion, which is very much I find a Western thing, there's just a vast, vast body of knowledge in this field. And even when you look at this table of different approaches to studying religion, it's just amazing the quantity of material that's out there. It includes theology, of course, history, anthropology, comparative religion, East-West approaches, psychoanalytical approaches, brain science, cognitive science, phenomenology, philosophy. What I'm most interested in, and what Krishnamurti was interested in, I think, is psychology. And you can divide psychology into individual and social. Let's say that I'm focusing on the individual, but like Krishnamurti, not ignoring the social, because we're saying that the change in the individual then has an impact on society as a whole. So what is Krishnamurti talking about? What has he talked about for 60 years? Is it religion or psychology? This is a question that came into my mind recently. And just recently, even after I decided what my topic would be for my PhD work, I began to discover new connections between Krishnamurti and Abraham Maslow, who of course was the American psychology I was deeply interested in 1998, 1999. And this goes back even before Abraham Maslow to William James at the turn of the last century. His definition of religion was focused on individual experience as well. So he was talking about individual people and their solitude. But he was also looking to some kind of growth potential in individuals. And he said most people live either physically, intellectually, or morally in a restricted circle of their potential. They are actually only using a very small portion of their potential consciousness. And this is something that probably inspired Abraham Maslow when he was considering his research and his theory of the self-actualized individual. There was another American psychologist named Gordon Allport that I discovered with some interesting connections to Krishnamurti and some interesting ideas about the psychology of religion. His main contribution was this notion of mature religion as opposed to immature religion. And he's described mature religion as being complex and has many related and structured elements to it. He also distinguished between this thing that he called intrinsic religion and extrinsic religion, and an inner sense of religious state as opposed to an outward sense. And he said that mature religion is intrinsic. It involves an ability to be critical and reflexive, and a willingness to test beliefs and change them or just discard them altogether. So I went back to Maslow and has discovered recently that he's one of the most cited psychologists in the field of psychology, but most of you will probably realize that that's probably because of his theory of the hierarchy of needs. And if you know anything about the hierarchy of needs as Maslow described it, he's got a pyramid where basic needs are at the bottom, and at the top of all the needs, when all an individual's needs are satisfied, at the very top, there's this need to be self-actualized, to achieve your full potential. And just recently, just a few months ago, I found out by reading a book that I discovered quite by accident that Maslow actually read a Krishnamurti book. So what does Maslow has to say on religion? A bit more. Here's what Maslow thinks. His religion is originally founded by someone he calls somebody like a prophet that receives a revelation or has a transcendental experience that gives this person an understanding of God, the world, or the self, or the human condition. But then religions get organized and they're carried on by some different person or different people. He calls them legalists. They're not really focused on the original material, and they become very organizational or bureaucratic. And then the whole original religion is lost. So what I discovered in American psychology and the way that it developed is one of the things Maslow inspired was this move from humanistic psychology to transpersonal psychology. So Maslow called humanistic psychology the third force. What he said is it's just the transition to prepare for a fourth higher force of psychology, which he called transpersonal. And an interesting parallel that I found between Maslow and Krishnamurti was this notion of education, according to Maslow, should be intended to help people transcend the conditioning imposed upon them by their own culture. So here he is focusing on a notion, a concept that's very, very key in Krishnamurti's thought as well. He also described 35 different meanings for this word transcendence. And in many of those 35 different descriptions, he used the word Taoistic, which I found a bit surprising because it, of course, tells me that Abraham Maslow was no stranger to Eastern religions and Eastern philosophies. But the very last, number 35, meaning of transcendence in Maslow's theory, was transcendence of one's own credo or system of values or systems of beliefs. And I found here, of course, another very close connection with Krishnamurti. One of the things that Maslow researched a great deal and described is his theory of peak experiences, which I don't know if you remember one of my slides on the self-actualizer. The self-actualizer is more inclined to have more peak experiences where the individual is really in the flow of things, feeling a sense of unity with everything around her. Maslow called it a peak experience. And he said that self-actualized people are more inclined to have more peak experiences in their lives. But he also said the most fundamental religious or transcendent experience is a totally private and personal one, not something that can be shared. Not only that, but the last important theory that Maslow wrote about was what he called Theory Z. And he began to understand that some of the people that he studied were self-actualizing people who are quite healthy in his view, but not necessarily transcending the sense of self. But on the other hand, he also found self-actualizing individuals who were transcendent, who did have transcendent experiences, and they were actually very central to their lives. So he studied people that he was acquainted with and others that he interviewed, but he also reviewed biographies of famous people. So as an example of self-actualizers that he decided were non-transcendent self-actualizers, he included Eleanor Roosevelt. And as one example of a self-actualizer who was also a transcendent individual, he included Aldous Huxley. Now recently, so fairly recently, from the 70s, we had a growth in American psychology of what they call the growth psychology. This notion that instead of focusing our psychology on what makes people sick mentally and how to make them better, or what some people refer to as well-adjusted. Maslow and others involved in growth psychology in America were interested in how individuals can attain their full potential, become self-actualized, and grow. So we had, there was a book I found that was called Growth Psychology, or had that in the title. It was published in '77, and it actually summarized developments that took place in the '60s and '70s. Nowadays, we have so many American scholars referring to Buddhist psychology. So you can see there the blending of Buddhism as a religion, but actually being also a psychology in the view of some scholars. We have an American Psychology Association, Section 36, I think since the '70s, devoted completely to the psychology of religion. In 2013, the first edition of an APA Handbook of Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality was published. And recently, Andrew Fuller published his approaches to psychology and religion, or psychology of religion, where he looks at different theories, including Gordon Allport, Abraham Maslow, William James, and that's now it's in its fourth edition, just came out, I think in 2015. Plus, we have academic journals involved in humanistic psychology and transpersonal psychology still around, as far as I know. And we have a rise in transpersonal psychology. This was something inspired by Maslow in the early '70s. And they're embracing Buddhist traditions as well. They're also applying them in individual and group settings, but they see spiritual engagement, something of the religious, is being seen as a key factor in individual growth and well-being. And I've also discovered an edited anthology called Transpersonal Knowing, Exploring the Horizon of Consciousness, published in 2000. So the focus here, the reason I point this out is just because what I think we're talking about is knowing as opposed to believing. There's some sense of the spiritual that knows as opposed to the religious that believes. That's what I'm trying to get at. So Gordon Allport published a book called The Individual and His Religion in 1951. And he was talking about mature and immature religion. He was talking about intrinsic and extrinsic religion. And mature religion is the intrinsic religion, in Allport's view. Krishnamurti's so-called psychology of religion, if I could call it that, speaks of serious people and not serious people, responsible attitudes and not responsible attitudes. So, for example, to quote from Krishnamurti, he's talking about what is your responsibility for human growth. He's just talking to people in one of his talks. What is your responsibility? And he gives us an example. If you feel responsible for a child, then you have affection for that child, you care for the child, and you interact with that child in a certain way. There's things you don't do and things you don't condition him or her to do or to think. But Krishnamurti says human beings are now conditioned to be irresponsible. And so he puts the question to his audience, what are the serious people going to do with the irresponsible people? His answer, I suppose, is we have to care for everyone. That's our responsibility in respect for our relationship with everyone else. So I'm asking this question or proposing this possibility that Krishnamurti is talking psychology. Why do I think that? Maybe because religion without beliefs is actually just psychology, or what we in the West call psychology. Krishnamurti indicated in that 1929 speech when he dissolved the Order of the Star that his aim was to help people to be unconditionally, which I take to mean psychologically free. How are they going to do that? they were going to learn to be aware of their own conditioning influences so that they do not add to creating conflict within the individual, which of course leads to conflict in society at large. So what does all this mean? Well, I think Krishnamurti can be implied in our own life. How do I apply Krishnamurti in my life? I recently discovered Krishnamurti's talk, perhaps, or a conversation that he had with someone. It was published under the title, A Dialogue with Oneself. And he's using negation, looking at an important topic. The topic is love. And he's going through an inquiry, a deep inquiry about trying to figure out what love is by talking about what love is not. So he goes through and investigates attachment, fear, pleasure, and the desire for comfort. And through his inquiry, decides that these things, if these things exist, it's not love. In other words, by negation, by seeing what love is not, you find out what love is. So then he says at the end of all this, must I go through all those step by step, one by one? To me, the notion of step by step suggests that there's a way, there's a process here. And it's something that can be applied by each and every one of us in our day-to-day lives in improving our relationships, in our understanding of our own self-knowledge and our understanding of others. So this is what I do. I just reflect on everything that I encounter in my life, thoughts, events, reactions, feelings. I do what I call deep inquiry, what Krishnamurti calls dialogue with myself. What I encounter, I try to be non-judgmental about it. And here I'm reminded of a term that Krishnamurti came up with called choiceless awareness. By choiceless, he means non-judgmental, having no choice about whether it's good or bad, whether you run away from it or try to overcome it. You stay with it. If you're in a mess, be a mess. So it involves acceptance of what has been, what will be, what is, but mostly what is. Change what can be changed, accept what cannot. And I realize that I've learned so much from Maslow and Krishnamurti, and a few others, of course. They've helped me to learn how to be a human being, which of course is still a work in progress. And just recently, even though I've been exposed to Krishnamurti for over 20 years, only recently have I learned from Krishnamurti how to be my own psychologist. But I'll finish with something from my favorite Canadian philosopher, Margaret Atwood.
Oh, so Jerry, are you finished?
It's the end.
Okay. Thanks very much. Maybe you can just stop.
Well,
Go ahead.
for now, anyway.
Okay. Maybe you can just stop screen sharing so we can have the whole crew on the screen. And now we have some time for questions or reflections. We have a good, decent amount of time. Rachel, or no, Rachel, do you have a question? Hard to see if that's what you're writing in the chat. No. So Jerry, I wonder if you could give us a bit of a kind of like a genealogy of the question that you're posing a little bit more. You gave us a bit of an account of that, but is your core question whether or not Krishnamurti is intending to create a new religion, just one without beliefs? And your answer is no, he's making a psychology. Is that the question and answer framing that you're doing here?
So Krishnamurti died in 1986. And of course, I've been in my a study of religion in America and the history of religion in America, I encountered this idea we call new religious movements, otherwise known as NRMs. There's a lot of material on this and a lot of discussion. And a lot of that stems from this fear of cults. Heaven's Gate suicide, the Jonestown suicide, drinking the Kool-Aid and all of that. And fear and that guy in Waco, Texas and all of that. So there's violence. So Americans are really concerned with this thing called new religious movements. Of course, others too, but others sometimes prefer to use the term alternative religions. So when I started looking at new religious movements, I considered, of course, well, this idea of having an opportunity to look at the possible incipient beginning of a potential religious movement. In other words, suppose Maslow was right. Religions start by way of a prophet having some kind of revelation or transcendent experience, and then telling a whole bunch of people what he or she discovered. And these other people coalesce around this person, and a religion is created. But then this original person dies. Other people take over, and they organize the teachings. And then it becomes no longer a religion. It becomes, well, it might still be a religion of sort, but Maslow says it becomes idolatry. It loses its zest. So what I thought is, suppose you take what Krishnamurti talked about, which we have all, so much of it's been recorded and transcribed. So we have it mostly word for word with very little editing. So you have a situation where he died in 1986, it's recent. We have all the technology that's recorded what he had to say. We have foundations and organizations charged with this task. They've given themselves of disseminating his teachings. What's going to happen over time as what he said about please don't interpret, please don't rely strictly on what I say, find out for yourself. What's going to happen 2-3 generations after his death and beyond, when there still is this corpus of teachings? Might there be a new religious movement founded on the basis of what Krishnamurti had to say? I'm not saying that's something he was interested in. He obviously was not, but he was well aware of the potential for it. So I'm wondering, is it possible that sometime in the future, near or later, some kind of a new religious movement will coalesce around Krishnamurti's teachings? And supposing that people accept that this is a religion that is a religion without any belief system or beliefs, there's no need for any beliefs, that would be really interesting. But of course, beyond that, then, what happens to our concept of what the word religion means? What happens to our concept of what psychology means? What happens to this arbitrary demarcation line in our academic fields of scholarship, this box we call religion, and this box we call psychology? What is it good for? What does it add to our own personal understanding of who we are as human beings? That's my question.
Peter? Oh, Scott, I think you have to let Peter unmute.
Thanks for the talk, Jerry. In all of his writings, did Krishnamurti, did his thinking evolve as he aged? And what did he get wrong in the early days that he changed in the later days?
Nothing changed much. So some words might have changed. The message stayed the same after 1929. So what changed was, in 1922, he had a big change in his life, some kind of an experience that he called the process. And then, so it took him a few years to think about his relationship with theosophy. And by 1929, he decided just to completely go on his own and separate himself from theosophy completely. But he was asked by one of his admirers and associates and close friends, Pupul Jayakar. He was asked, and this was recorded, transcribed, and published as chapter 1 in one of her 2 books about Krishnamurti. She asked him if his message has changed, and he said, some of the words and language might have changed, but the message stays the same. So for 60 years, well, not 60, but say 19, his corpus is divided into up until 1933 and from 1933 to 1986. So that's what, 53 years. But I've asked myself that question because it's an interesting one. Why? I have a sense that your question flows from some point you'd like to make. Would you like to elaborate on your question? Why do you ask?
Scott, could you let Peter?
We're playing the unmute fight. I think because as prophets go, he lived a lot longer than many of the other prophets. And in all that time and in his travels and moving from country to country and then years and years in California, I wonder how that would change a person's thinking as he got contact with more people and did more reading. So it's a question about the development of the person and the development of his religious flavor, and what you found in a critical read of his work.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add any. I see Rachel wants to say something.
Yeah, thanks. So this is going to reveal my ignorance, but I know basically nothing about Krishnamurti. And I'm wondering, so folks who have written on Krishnamurti in the past, so like Hillary Rodrigues and others, so has their argument been that he is starting a religion, that it is a new religious movement, that people that follow him have that, and your work is to kind of push back at that and show where that doesn't hold? Or I'm just trying to understand like what's been written about him before in terms of his relationship to some notion of a religion or a new religious movement or that sort of thing, and kind of where the hole was that you decided to go, I'm going to fill that, I'm going to push back at that. Or because most of our projects come from reading something and then going, I don't think that quite gets it. Or so I'm just wondering how Krishnamurti has been written about in the past. And so is your contribution like drastically different? Does it, like, how does it fit with scholarship that exists on him already? Sorry if that doesn't make sense, but I'm just trying to still grasp who Krishnamurti was and how people have dealt with him in the past and where you enter into the scholarship.
Yeah, no, good question. So the idea of Krishnamurti or his corpus of teachings being the foundation for a new religious movement, that's bold. Bold for anyone who has any admiration for Krishnamurti, which I have a great deal of. I have a great love for Krishnamurti, even though I've obviously never met the man. And Ashley, Neelish, welcome. And I hope you don't mind me mentioning you, because one of the things that I encountered about Krishnamurti while doing a course with Neelish was that I learned a whole lot more about this notion of guru. And here's another thing about Krishnamurti. It would be bold to suggest that Krishnamurti, even though he did not want to be perceived as a guru, he didn't want followers or disciples, or maybe followers is more appropriate, but he didn't want to be seen as a guru. And he actually, in some of his talks, he denigrates gurus. But one thing I discovered while taking a course with Nilesh was this notion of the guru-shishya relationship, the guru-disciple relationship. And so I took the stance of being negative about it. In other words, not accepting what seems to be the traditional approach, or what seems to be what Krishnamurti wants us to think, but taking the opposite side and seeing what I find. And so I started to look at Krishnamurti's discourse. In other words, I started looking very closely at how he was talking, what words he was using, and how he was responding to questions and what he was saying. And then I discovered this book called Guru English, where a scholar had persuasively shown how there is a particular language, usage of English, that can be attributed to someone who is in the status of a guru. And I found that really interesting. I wasn't expecting it. I found that Krishnamurti had displayed some of these features. The same applies to new religious movements. I think it would be unusual because people reading Krishnamurti, although he does have his detractors, I must say I've discovered some very interesting Krishnamurti detractors. They're all, I think they have all either lived or now live in London, England. And I think, well, anyway, that's enough said about them. But I have discovered them, and I have some respect for what they have to say. And I've written about that too, because that was another good way that I thought to understand. Well, I just wanted to understand where they were coming from. But anyway, it would be pretty unusual to consider that Krishnamurti was the founder of a new religious movement. But I thought I'd just look at it. What does it feel like? I'd put it on and see how it fits. And it is my part of my dissertation proposal and part of my research plan to do that. Whether anyone else has written with that in mind, a couple of people that I've read mentioned the notion of Krishnamurti being the anti-guru guru, and also being the founder of the no religion religion. So I don't know if they're being, tongue-in-cheek cynical, or if, because they haven't really expanded on those thoughts. I've seen it here and there, but I plan to do a whole workup on that very thought. So it's an excellent question. I don't know, what do you think? Is it creative?
I'll let others jump in and we can talk more tomorrow at Coffee Talk, Jerry.
Let's go Sepide and then Catherine.
Yes, hi, Sepide here. Thank you for your talk. You might have touched on this previously, but I was going to ask, when somebody says that the meaning of concept X is only valid when it's attributed to nothingness, when you add a thing to it, then you defeat the purpose. So I don't understand. It feels like those people who believe in Krishnamurti so much that want to be his followers and make up a religion, they are going against the essence of what he says, that there is no belief. So to be one of the most avid followers and not do the exact same thing that the guru is saying, which is religion is having no belief, and having a belief in that kind of defeats the purpose. And you might have touched on this, but again, I feel like anyone who wants to be the follower of Krishnamurti and create a religion of what he's saying is not understanding what he is saying, which is not to be a follower and have a belief. So if you have a comment about that, that would be great. Yeah, thanks.
I have a very brief comment. So I'm now a PhD candidate, which means I'm about halfway through my program. And the rest of my program includes a research component which involves oral history. In other words, interviewing people. And my intention in this research, where I am going to interview people, is I'm going to ask people to describe for me how they enact their lives in a way that they feel is in accord with what Krishnamurti had to say. So I can't, so in other words, what I'm trying to say is that if you give me 3, 4, 5 years till after I'm finished, I might have something relevant on that. Right now, I don't know, but I have the question, same as you do.
Thanks, Jerry. Catherine, then Alan.
So this sent me back to the mid-60s, where everybody was reading in my circle Krishnamurti and Maslow. But I'm surprised that unless you made this point in the very first few minutes when I wasn't present, why you haven't connected this to this new orientation of spirituality without religion. I think you can make an argument that Krishnamurti was the foundation of this kind of perspective. And now, even though there's not a direct link between his thought or Maslow's thought, in point of fact, there is a movement within the culture that one could see a relationship in that earlier thinking of these two key figures.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for mentioning that. One of the first areas of religion that I was looking at, so maybe in the beginning of the PhD about a couple of years ago, I was looking at this whole idea of the folks who were answering the surveys about their religion by identifying themselves as being spiritual, but not religious. But I didn't want to get into it today because there's a whole vast area that I've discovered that deals with the concepts of spiritual on the one hand, and the concept of religious on the other hand. And that, yeah, I think a lot of us could probably write a book on that. So I left it aside, but maybe I shouldn't have. I should maybe have included it, but I also didn't go back really to the 60s. And that's a big part of my PhD work as well, is the history of religion in America in the 60s, because that, I think it's very key to what you just said. So there's a chapter in the PhD probably about that, but I didn't bring it to this talk. But thank you for mentioning it.
All right, thanks, Catherine. Last question to Alan.
My question follows to some extent Catherine's. You were quite insistent at the beginning of your talk that you were not and never had been a spiritual seeker. My question is twofold. If you're not a spiritual seeker, who is? And it is perhaps the term spiritual seeker one of those things that can be defined by saying only what it is not?
Well, I was hoping someone would have something to say about that, and I'm glad we saved that for the last question.
Oh, just because that's where I was in the queue.
Well, where I see myself as where I was then, 25 years ago or so, is that I was looking for my Gemeinschaftsgefühl. I was looking for community and a place to live in harmony with nature. But I was already finished with my seeking. So, but that, of course, you know, it's, I don't know if, it wouldn't be fair to try and explain all that in 2 minutes. It wouldn't be fair to you, Alan. But hey, maybe that's something else we could take up tomorrow. I don't know, unless somebody feels a bit cheated by my, what is that, an evasive response? I can elaborate, I don't mind. I'm not here to hide anything.
Well, maybe tomorrow you can think it through more carefully. But it just strikes me that you're as much a spiritual seeker as any of the rest of us.
Cool. I'm okay with that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's worthwhile to think, not now because it's too late, but for tomorrow maybe to think about the extent to which the project that you're undertaking is a project in conceptual testing. You're testing certain concepts, religion, spiritual, psychological, and you're sort of doing that through the case study of Krishnamurti and the movement that he spawned. It seems to me that's kind of what's going on here. And the question of your own motivations or your own inclinations is something you are being evasive about for sure, because that's actually coloring your reading of Krishnamurti, which is fine. That happens in the work that many of us do, right? And it's worthwhile to also think maybe tomorrow again about these big macro categories and the way in which we get invested in these conceptual boundaries: religion, spirituality, humanistic psychology, etc. But just as a reminder of the way in which, you know, there are always social, political, psychological forces at work in all of our work, right? And so, any final comments, Jerry, before we sign off and give people a sense of what's coming next week?
I'm good.
No? Okay, well, thanks very much. As I think Rachel mentioned that she hadn't been introduced to Krishnamurti much, but you got a bit of a taste of him today. I think we'll learn more about him tomorrow. I think he's quite a fascinating thinker, visionary prophet figure, and he gives us a great opportunity to think about the way in which, as Jerry pointed out, the way in which groups begin with this kind of big emergence of this prophetic person who then kind of spawns a group, and that group gets then institutionalized or routinized, and then there's a kind of a changing of, as it were, the gospel into a kind of a structure of some sort. Then there's mixed feelings about the structure that gets created. So I think Jerry's tracing some interesting tropes in the study of religion through Krishnamurti, and I think it'll be good to be looking at both those tropes further with Jerry, and also Krishnamurti himself, who's a really pretty fabulously interesting, charismatic, profound thinker, I think. Anyway, thanks very much, Jerry. Talia, if you can give us a sense of what's coming next week. Okay. Dominique is giving her talk next week, same time, same place. So those of you who are on our list will be able to have our note. Oh, looks like the slide is not present. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so Dominique Ledeff from Montreal is going to be giving the lecture next week, which then just disappeared. It's playing hide and seek with us, but I think you've seen it, and please see our website if you want to get a better sense of what she's talking about and when and how to access it. All right, take care, everybody. See you next week. Bye.